Do white-led spiritual communities and coaching communities help or hinder Black women on their spiritual path and in their spiritual growth? And if you are a Black woman or a brown woman who has either left the church or is on an alternative spiritual path, or maybe you haven't, you know, joined up or linked up with an African traditional religion, you might find yourself in a spiritual community that's primarily white women or non-Black people. And so, do those communities help or do they hinder you on your spiritual journey, particularly as a Black woman? That's what we're getting into today. Hi, my name is Trina Parham, and I am a spiritual teacher and guide for Black women who are on alternative spiritual paths, who are looking for a way to reconnect to themselves and to connect to their ancestors and do all of that good work. And so, if that sounds like you, you're in the right place. I'm glad you're here. And this channel is particularly geared towards if you're pretty new on that path, or maybe you've been on a solitary journey and you're looking for some support. So, this is the place for you. I have something called the Wild Waters Retreat. It's a 2-hour virtual retreat that I offer, and I'll tell you more about that later. And you can learn more about it on a free call with me. But anyway, so let's get back to the topic. So I wanted to talk about these spiritual communities that a lot of Black women find themselves in. I know I certainly did when you are on your spiritual path and on your spiritual journey. And particularly if you haven't linked up with any type of ATR where you're a part of a house of some kind, or you're under some other type of religion, you're really on a solitary path. You end up in these coaching communities and in these spiritual, dynamics. And I wanted to talk about this experience because I think I there's so much on the internet, there's so much on social media in terms of spirituality. And I think it can be hard to find your way. And a lot of Black women um, uh, end up in these communities. And I don't know how much we're getting out of it or if it's geared towards us, but there's a few distinctions that I want to talk about. And I think it would be good for those of us who have been in these communities to come together and talk about our experiences. So I have been a part of sort of the coaching space, the spiritual online space communities, sort of women's communities for a very long time. I would say probably since the mid to late mid 2000s. So I started, and I'm going to be talking about business coaching and running an online business in conjunction with this because I think the communities often run parallel and they are often intertwined. So you might hear me referencing spiritual communities, you might hear me referencing a business community or a coaching community or an online community, something like that. It's all together. Yeah, it's all together. So, like I said, I started my first business back in 2005 or 6. And that led me to, I will never forget, I was in a job that I didn't love. I was a grant writer at the time. And there were just some days at work where I would be so bored. Like after I finished a proposal or something like that, I would have days at a time where I wasn't doing very much work or I didn't have a lot of work to do. And so I was getting bored. I was getting bored and I was starting to, just do research and see, what else was out there. And I came across a woman who had a newsletter called Changing Course. And I will never forget, and there were a bunch of newsletters in her archive, and I just remember devouring everything in her archive. This was my first time really hearing about like entrepreneurship and all of that. And so I was just devouring it. And this also dovetailed with what was going on in my spiritual life. So at that point, I had left the church and I was on my spiritual path. And so at that time, I started getting into more sort of self help books. And although I always read those books, even when I was a teenager, even when I was still in the church and identified as a Christian, I was reading lots of books just around self development, spiritual development, personal development, self-help, all of those things. I think I just had I had a need for it, I had a desire for it. And so that's something that I'd done for a long time. But anyway, around this time, I was also reading a lot of Wayne Dyer books and just things around living a different kind of life, getting on a different path. I think I might have started reading Pema Chodron. Sark was another one. A friend had given me a Sark book a few years prior to that. And so all of this was blending together for me. So anyway, back to this newsletter. I was reading this newsletter, and the woman who created it, she partnered with another woman, and they created an event called Work at What You Love. And it was in Northampton, Massachusetts. It was like a 3-day weekend thing. And so I went to this thing, and it really helped me launch sort of my first business. I had a t-shirt business, and I was doing like workshops. I was doing a lot of sort of anti-violence, domestic violence, sexual assault prevention, you know, while before I was doing the grant writing. And so I was doing my own workshops and things like that. And so I was trying to figure out what could I do with all of this? Like, how could I create a business? Anyway, that's how I sort of started getting in all these communities. And what I soon discovered is that, there's all of these people and things and communities are very connected. And so I think, and as time progressed and more, and I got, online more, and, more websites became popular and social media became popular and things like that. I also want to say, living in New York City, there was a huge community of women business owners who were also spiritual in spiritual community that all knew each other. So there were a lot of events, like big events that happened in the city. And so if you were in business and in sort of spiritual women's communities around, I'm going to say 2007 to 2013, like in that period, we probably know a lot of the same people. We were probably at a lot of the same events. And these communities, like I said, were filled with women who were growing their businesses and who were, like I said, hosting women's circles, just a lot of events that were guiding women in some kind of way. I know some of the big names. I'm only mentioning some of the bigger people because I know a lot of people met in these communities, like Mama Gina. Mama Gina was a big one. She was based in New York City, had a lot of sort of followers and community. Marie Forleo, before she got huge, I think she was local to New York also. And so there were a few others, but I think Gabby Bernstein, like there were a few other folks where there are these large events where these people that a lot of people know now were, I think, more local to New York around that time. And so, they were all white women. There were a few women of color. I don't know off the top if there were any Black women, none that I really knew who were in that world. And side note, I think one of the reasons why a lot of Black women ended up in those communities in particular is because they were a lot more accessible. And so, what I know now about a lot of like African traditional religions and other paths, it's, a lot of those are closed practices. And so, if you are not going to initiate or something like that, it can be hard to access a lot of the information. A lot of us, just Black people, our traditions are more oral, and so we don't necessarily have a lot of things written down. And there also weren't a lot of books around Black women and spirituality. I remember around in that same time frame, there was a book. Not there was a bookstore around 14th Street called East West Books, and I met a Black woman in there who had showed me. I'd never even thought about tarot. This was right around the time when I started learning about tarot, and she had showed me the Mother Peace deck. And so, if you're familiar with tarot at all, or the Mother Peace deck, the Mother Peace tarot deck, they're circle cards. They're circular. So if you know a regular tarot deck, they're just rectangular decks with, a very traditional Rider Waite Smith. Those are the creators of the tarot deck, the traditional tarot deck that we all know. But anyway, this Mother Peace deck they were circular cards. And I say that to say this, this Black woman that I met, she was the first Black person that I knew or had met who was really involved with, like I said, tarot and sort of on that alternative path. And again, this is coming from someone who was born and raised in the church. So I did not know a lot of people who were Black who weren't Christian. I knew some folks who were Muslim, but not really. So if they were Black, they were Christian or they were in some other form of religion. And so to be on this path where I was exploring the goddess, the feminine face of God, the divine feminine, you know, um, sort of some of the more witchy practices, and I was learning, meditation and learning about the elements and all of these different things, and any, I didn't know any really Black people who were into that. And so it took me a long time to find and connect with those people and those women. And so I think that uh, and as a result, I ended up in a lot of communities with non-black people, and many of them were led by white women. And so I think that I had some good teachers. There's one woman in particular I'm thinking of who was a combination of very spiritual, powerful priestess, also a business coach and mentor. She was amazing. Her community was amazing. I was one of maybe two Black people who were in that community. And then I ended up in a really loving community that was led by an Indian woman. And those women I'm still friends with and in community with to this day. And it was a very diverse group. And you would think in New York City, a lot of these groups would be a little bit more diverse than they were. But that particular community was diverse. And like I said, I'm still friends with and in community with a lot of those women. Excuse me, I'm just going to turn the fan on. Um, Sorry about that. Anyway, so just being in that community, um, I met a lot of women who were, sort of into the same things that I was into. And I think, the challenge with a lot of these communities is I think the foundation of what you believe and why was different. So for example, I think the idea of manifestation came up a lot. And it was interesting to hear about manifestation, growing a business, or spiritual practices that were meant to enhance your life in some way being taught by someone that was thin and white and rich, or who came from a family with money and tried to convince other people that that wasn't the foundation of their success, or why their prayers were answered, or why this manifestation practice or this meditation practice helped them get whatever it was that they got. And so I think that more than anything is one of the things that stood out to me that was different. And so and it was one of those things that people didn't talk about or they danced around. And I'm like, for a lot of Black women in those communities, I'll speak for myself specifically, I came from a working class family and community, even though I went to, private schools and things like that. I came from a working class family. And so the idea that prayer, meditation, or whatever spiritual practice worked in a certain way, and to see all of the things that they were able to attract, I, I had to ask myself, is it because of the spiritual path that they're on? Or is it because of who they were born to be? And I definitely sided on the latter, but they weren't positioning it that way. And I had a hard time. It was like things weren't making sense. And where I saw, at least for me and some other Black women, where it was a little more challenging. And so I think the other thing about a lot of those spiritual communities and coaching communities is you tend to do well if you come from money. If you come from money, if you are successful in your own right, or if you already have a very successful career, if you already make six figures, high six figures, multiple six figures, whatever in your profession, then it's like those communities are like an add-on. Versus, I think when you come from the church, you know, the I mean, there are poor people in the church. I mean, that's just what it is. And so I think our relationship to what is the function of this of spirituality? What is the function of the church? What is the function of all these spiritual practices? What are they meant to do? How are they meant to help? And so I think that's something that I had to sit with a lot because for myself, there were things that I needed. I was in jobs that I did well. They paid okay, but I really wanted to have my own business. That was a big part of what I needed. Also, I had a lot of heart healing to do. I was in therapy. I'd been I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse. So I was, I had been in therapy for a long time as far as that goes. And so I was healing. I was healing. I was nursing and tending to my inner child. I was doing a lot of that sort of stuff. And so I think those communities felt like a safe space in a lot of ways. So they were opening me up to new ways of understanding spirituality. I'd never, even though I was dreaming about the goddess and I was having this personal connection on my own time and in my own way, but I had never had this codified experience of a spirituality or a spiritual path that didn't tie to the church. And like I said, these were the only people I knew who had access to that or who understood that and who were open to me and talking about it. And so, so I tapped in, and I think a lot of Black women do tap into those communities. And it's interesting. I mean, I never experienced any outright racism in those groups. I think uh, I think the women in those communities were very open for the most part, at least not to my face. But there were definitely a lot of classism elements. There was definitely a lot of fat phobia. There was definitely a lot of so many other things that were in that group, in those groups. But yeah, and so I think a lot of but I can see how it can be isolating if you're a Black woman in some of these communities because, they just don't have the voice, and it's not really their fault. They're really speaking to their people. They're attracting other white women, and you just so happen to be there. That's kind of the way I took it. It's like there are things in this group, there are things in this community that I can access and that are for me. I know how to navigate and take what I need and take what's for me and leave the rest. And so I think as a Black woman in these white led spiritual spaces, you have to do that a lot. And so they don't really know or cater to a lot of, I think, the needs of Black women in those spaces. And and quite frankly, they don't know how. And so, and that's is that really their problem? I don't know. I mean, I think I would want a spiritual leader to be able to hold space for people who come from all sorts of different backgrounds, and then as I went along my spiritual path, I learned, a lot of the tools and the things that they use were extracted from other communities. They love, extracting things from indigenous folks and from, Indian people and, all other communities and sort of making this hodgepodge of spirituality. A lot of that was taken from ATRs. A lot of that was taken from, Black people too, and kind of put all together, and they created whatever they wanted it to be. And so I think it was confusing in that regard, but again, things I had to kind of learn and experience on my own. And as I went along and time passed, I started connecting with other Black women and other Black people who were on a different path, whether they were agnostic or atheist, or they were just on their own spiritual work. Maybe they were Buddhist or, something else. And so I found it, really healing and grounding when I started connecting with those communities of Black people and Black women who were doing that work. Just meeting other Black women who read tarot or who reverenced the goddess and in the ways that I did. And, that was a part of their life. So I think these communities, there's a lot of conversation online about, spiritual communities and coaching and how coaching, it's almost like a pyramid scheme to some people, or it's like an MLM or something like that? Or is it's a little culty? And I've been thinking about this a lot and trying to figure out how I feel about it. And I think as someone who, like I said, I had a previous business. I had a dating and relationship coaching business. I ran that business for almost 10 years. I would say I ran it for 10 years, and I was working full time while I ran that business. And, when you are in the online business space or you're in these coaching communities, they really make you believe that you can do anything and that anything is possible. And it just takes a few things, to make it work, and that's it. And I have to say, I was at that business for years before it really took off. I mean, I was this was when blogs were really big, so I was blogging, I wrote a book. I was working with clients, but it was hard. It was hard getting clients, and I had, as a social worker and someone who didn't have any sort of any marketing, branding, or any of that experience, and didn't have a lot of money to really spend on it. Although I invested as much as I could, and over the years, I've invested thousands of dollars in coaching and programs, whether it was spiritual in nature or business or whatever. I have invested probably hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past, I don't know, 20 years or something. Um, and so what I learned is that I think there are a few things that make it work and why some people are really successful. I think if you have those sort of foundational skills in business, if you have a charismatic personality that a lot of people are drawn to, that's something that's like the X factor in these coaching communities, and having a coaching business or something like that that you really can't account for, or someone that can be really committed to a thing. For a while, I changed my mind a lot because I wasn't sure of what I wanted to do. And when you are a woman and a Black woman at that in the dating space at that time, it was challenging because a lot of people expected me to be married and I wasn't. And it's not like now where everyone with a microphone has a podcast about relationships regardless of their relationship status. It was like the women who were in that space were married, and the men could be single or married. And so, it was hard, but what worked best for me was being in person. And I had a coach actually tell me that my business was very high touch and that I needed to get in the room with people, and she was absolutely right. That's what grew my business. So it wasn't necessarily online, but it was still a coaching community that I had been a part of where I learned those things. And now I see a lot of these I see a lot of people in these coaching spaces where they struggle and they don't have a clear vision, they don't have a clear purpose, they don't really know what they're doing. And I think some coaches take advantage of that. I think some coaches take advantage of people. And there's a lot of smoke and mirrors out here. There's a lot of nonsense. There's a lot of bullshit. And I think that you have to be savvy enough to know how to sift through it. That being said, I do think that there are coaches, legit coaches, who know what they're doing and who can be very helpful. Now, for me, I am a social worker. I have a master's degree in social work from Columbia University. I have a bachelor's in social work. I've coached leaders. I've coached women in around relationships and love. I've coached folks. I've done executive coaching, which is what I do in my other business outside of my spiritual work. I've been leading and guiding spiritual communities, specifically in circle work and sort of ceremony and ritual, for 10 years. And prior to that, I was a leader in my church. And I have a lot of experience in history, in addition to doing my own personal development and my own personal work. And so that is the breadth of experience that I bring to coaching and to, my spiritual work. And a lot of people, I think, get into this and don't necessarily have that, but they know how to market. And I think this is another thing about a lot of these white-led communities, is that they make it look pretty. They've got the right, Instagram, memes and pictures and images and stories, and they draw you in with this really beautiful, flowery, language. And I think they do, a lot of white women in this space do a really great job of creating an image. They create an image of what we believe spirituality to be. So they've got the flowers and the candles and the crystals, and they've got money. And so, and they look a certain way. And so you put all of that together and you assume that they are the one that you should be following. And it works. It works because people like beautiful things. They like to, buy in. They want to buy in. People want to buy into stories. People like fantasy, and so that's what they create. And when you get behind the curtain in a lot of those communities, you see it's not real, or it's real, and these folks really have trained and they believe in what they're doing, but it's just not helpful or beneficial for everyone. And whereas I think, again, with a lot of Black, women in these spaces, I think Black women are doing more of that sort of beauty, aesthetic, spiritual aesthetic thing that is attracting more people. And not that it necessarily has to be that, but I think it's more outwardly facing, and it's more easily accessible. And I see a lot more of that now. And so there's lots of podcasts that I love. There's a little Juju. I love her podcast, and there's others, but that's the first one that comes to mind. But anyway, and so I think that uh, a lot of Black women, like I said, as they're making their spiritual work more accessible, um, they're attracting a lot more Black women to the work. But it's still more behind the scenes. I think it's more, like I said, it's that oral tradition. It's that it's more veiled because we have to have close practices, because we know how folks get when they just, they rape and pillage anything that Black people create. And so it's important that those things are protected, and rightly so. And so I don't know that, you know, Black women in spiritual spaces can be as open, as some of their white counterparts. And so I think that can be a challenge. But anyway, I think coaching, and it's so interesting. I listen to a lot of podcasts and a lot of YouTubers who talk about coaching and the problem in the coaching industry. And what's so funny about it is, even though a lot of these people are right on with what they're saying, they're people who still sell how to market your business online, or they still sell coaching you on how to coach, or they're coaching you on how to do the thing that they're criticizing. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because they're in the industry and they have a lot of feedback and things to say. But I'm more curious to hear from people who don't have a business that's teaching you how to run a business, and what their experience is like in this coaching space and the critiques that they have of this industry. And so that is what I'm more interested in. So if you're someone like that, I'd love to talk to you, because I think that's what I'm more interested in. If you are not coaching people on how to coach other coaches, or how to run an online business or a digital product business or whatever, like people who actually take the information from those communities and they actually apply it to another industry or another area. I think that's a telltale sign. And a lot of what I see is, a lot of coaches, a lot of business coaches, for example, they get into this space because their previous business didn't work. Like I've seen quite a few. There was a boom of health coaches around, I would say, 2009 into 2013, 2014. I know there's people who are still becoming health coaches and who were health coaches prior to that. I actually worked with one who was great years ago. But a lot of those health coaches, either weren't successful in their business, or they struggled to get clients, and they pivoted into business coaching. And I think so that was interesting. I'm like, so is what you're teaching, does it actually work for someone who's not talking about business and teaching people how to do the thing that you just did? But because you're selling people on how to make money, that's what's actually working, and not the actual structure. Um, And I think it's the same for spiritual communities where someone can um, I think, show this lifestyle that they will claim they were able to create as a result of certain spiritual practices or things like that. But they don't tell you the behind the scenes. They don't tell you that they have a trust fund. They don't tell you that they have a spouse or significant other that is a millionaire or makes high six figures. They don't tell you that they themselves had a job on Wall Street where they were making $300,000 a year. That's how they funded their business, or that's how they fund their life. So when you see them flying around, jet setting, and doing whatever, that's how they pay for it. And again, I'm someone who travels a lot, but I keep it pretty low key. And I've been traveling a long time. I've been traveling most of my life, but I'm not, flying private jets and doing all this other stuff, which I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If that's your lifestyle, hey, I say do it. But the issue is taking spiritual principles and pretending that those spiritual principles and practices are what actually got them there. And I see this a lot in white led spiritual communities. They really gaslight people, not all of them, but many of them will gaslight people into believing that this particular technique or spiritual practice is what got them XYZ when it was really, that they just have really great health insurance or that, they make a lot of money and, that is why they're so peaceful and why they can do whatever. And so it is extremely misleading in a lot of these communities. And so I think the big question then becomes, what is it all for? And this is something that I ask myself a lot. What is the purpose of spirituality? What is the purpose of all of this? And it's an important question because when you find yourself in these spiritual communities, it's like, what is it that you're exactly after? Is it the community because you need to connect with other people and that has its own value? Is it that, you need to be in sacred communion and space with other people that has its own value? Or, is it, are you there because you have a true material need, whether it's money, resources, relationships, whatever it is, and you're expecting, this community to be able to help you get those resources or get the thing that you need? What is the purpose of all of it? And I think back to, my days in the church, in the Black church. I grew up in a Baptist church, and it was like so many folks were praying to have their light bill paid. And I'm like, after 20 years, you're still struggling to have the light bill paid. How are you still having the same prayer? I'm saying the prayer didn't work if that's what's happening. And it's like, what else can we do so that you don't have to keep praying this prayer that obviously is not being answered? Or you just get it, you just get it, you just get it. And so I do think that people that come from money and that come from resources, that they do have things and wisdom that they can impart to other people who didn't have that and didn't grow up with money or didn't grow up in a certain way. But they need to be honest about that and not attribute what they have or what they've been able to accumulate or amass to spirituality. It's much better for them to not say it's a secret. Remember that book by I can't remember her name, something Byrne. But anyway, it's not the secret. It's the secret is that you come from a family with money. That's the secret. And it's not this actual manifestation practice or think and grow rich. It's none of those things. It's just that you come from money. And as a result of that, you're very resourceful. And so that's a much more honest conversation. And again, this the spiritual community that I was a part of, it's sort of spiritual in business that I was in years ago. The woman the leader of that group was an Indian woman, and she was very honest about that. She was very honest about how she came from money. She was very honest about, the investments that she had into her business. You combine that with her being a very charismatic person and a very likable person, and she had a very successful business and community. And so I think what drew me to her was the fact that she was so honest. She was so upfront. She was, being realistic. And that's the way that she spoke to me and others who were in the group. And so I found that to be very valuable. And I think a lot of Black women who are in those communities, if it's someone like that, you find it valuable. But when they start to lie to you, when they start to pretend that it's something that it isn't, that's when I think I have a problem. That's when I have a problem. And that's when I know it doesn't work for myself and other Black women who are in those spaces. And on another note, I think it can be very lonely if you are the only one, just being the only Black person in a sea of white people, particularly if you come from the church where your spirituality, your spiritual community was primarily Black people, and then all of a sudden you're surrounded by all these white women. And it depends too on your relationship that you have with white women outside of spirituality. And there's a lot of conversation around how white women and Black women engage with each other at work, and the way that a lot of white women can terrorize Black women in the workplace. That's not what this video is about, but I bring it up because those dynamics impact you when you go into spiritual spaces and communities. All of those things and issues don't just dissolve because you're in the spiritual space, but it can be a very interesting dynamic. And like I said, I think a lot of white women have access to a lot of spiritual technologies. So they do the ayahuasca retreats in Peru, although a lot more Black people are doing that nowadays. And I actually have a mentor who does that, and leads Black women on these on these sort of experiences. But I think that's another thing that I see where a lot of white women will they invest a lot of money. They invest a lot of money. They have a lot of money to invest in these spiritual sort of tools and things that they then share and sell for quadruple the price or whatever it is that they do. And so, but I do think that them doing that, it gives other people access to those things. And it's nice. Some of it is interesting, some of it's very helpful. But again, I think it's more about what can these things actually do for you. And don't attribute something to these tools and things that you've learned that shouldn't be attributed to them, things that should be attributed to wealth and your family success and your success. So I think that's something that it's important to differentiate. And like I said, that's the part that people aren't honest about. And I think that's the thing that burns me up the most about it. Mm, so let's see, what else do I want to say about this topic? I overall, I think the coaching community and the coaching space, I think it's good. Like I said, I've been a coach and someone trained as a social worker, and having that background, I have a different perspective than someone who's just coming in off the street with no sort of background doing this kind of work. Um, I think there's some bad people who do it and people who are culty, and there's people who aren't, and you just have to be extremely discerning. I think if people are making promises to you that sound too good to be true, they probably are. Although there are people who are very successful, whether it's in a spiritual community or in a business community or something like that with their coaching business. I've seen it. I know people who are. And I just think the nuance of success is just that, it's nuanced and it's very particular to people. What it might be their personality, maybe they're very charismatic, maybe they just have a lot of resources, whatever it is. And I don't think people are being as honest about that. And so people end up, you know, with the grift, they end up, they end up being scammed, or the feeling like they got scammed because they don't understand the sort of the foundational elements that went into someone's success. And the person who was teaching them or guiding them isn't honest about it. Um, I think if you're in spiritual community with non-Black people, that you have to connect to your roots in some kind of way. And for Black people, especially, and Black women, I'm always going to say you do it through your ancestors. You connect to your ancestors, and that's part of the work that I do in my Wild Waters retreat. So if you're interested in signing up for the Wild Waters retreat, there's a link below this video where you can sign up for a free 30-minute call where we'll get to know each other a little bit, and we'll see if that virtual retreat's right for you. But I think learning how to connect to your ancestors and really use spirituality in the way that you need it, and to be able to connect to the sacred, connect to the holy, connect to that thing that's bigger than you is really important. Now, I also consider myself agnostic, and so I I say that because I don't always know what all of it's for in terms of spirituality. It brings comfort for sure. It makes me feel closer to the divine and all of that. Um, are prayers answered? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I think prayer is more about intention more than anything, and concentrated intention, which I think goes a long way, and getting your mind focused on something specific. And so, do we have help from, the heavenly realm or from the other world? I think, again, I think ancestors can guide us. Do they make things happen? I don't know. I think it depends on who you ask. Everyone has a different relationship to that, to answered prayer or manifestation or whatever it is. And I don't think there's any one answer. There's some people who it feels like they get their prayers answered. There's other people who don't. For every person that has a relative that was healed from cancer, someone else prayed the same prayer, did the same manifestation, practice, and their relative died, their loved one died. So I don't think there's a hard and fast rule around any of that. Um, yeah, that's it. That's it. I don't know exactly where I was going with that. I think I lost my train of thought. But anyway, um, that's it. There's so much more I could say about this topic. Um, Again, I think if you're in these spiritual communities, if you're in these white-led spiritual communities, connect with your ancestors, connect with other Black people who are on a similar spiritual path as you. I don't think these communities are completely not for us. I think you can find your place in them, but I think there's a cultural element that is typically missing, and that can be extremely frustrating. I know for me that doesn't really work, but other folks are fine with that. I think at this point there are so many Black women and there are so many diverse spiritual communities that I would encourage you to lean into. I think just predominantly or all white spiritual communities at this point is a no for me, but I think you can glean some things from it. There's one particular spiritual community where there was a conversation around, sort of politics and what's happening right now. And I had to get out because I'm like, I'm not about to argue with these people about politics, because I'm like, I'm just gonna get heated. It's just gonna be, and I was one of the only people that was saying what I was saying, and I'm like, that's how I know it's time for me to exit. So, especially over these next 4 years, I'm not interested in the spiritual bypassing. I'm not interested in people denying what's happening. I'm not interested in, a lot of the politics that people in spiritual communities often have. And so that's why I think that cultural element and having sort of that Black connection in your spiritual life is really important. But, there are non Black people who really are sort of civically minded and who are on the same page as you and me, whatever page you're on in terms of your politics and your beliefs and your views and things like that. And I think I don't think we can afford to be in spiritual community with people these days who aren't on that page. And this is not about to, I'm not about to get political, but you know what page I'm talking about. So I think it's important that those values align. Otherwise, it's going to get really weird very fast. And it will make you extremely uncomfortable and trying to do the spiritual thing, but then the politics and all the other conversations don't align. It's going to be very incongruous, which is going to feel extremely uncomfortable. And you're not going to want to be there. And you're going to start questioning all sorts of things about your spirituality and what you're doing, so on and so forth. So it's not worth it to me, but do what you feel is right. But I would say, there's lots of other communities to tap into. They might be a little harder to find, but they're out there. We're out here. We're doing this work. We're connecting with each other and all of that. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening and being here. As I said, if you're interested in the Wild Waters virtual retreat, and that is if you're looking for a guide to sort of hone in your own personal spiritual practice, and tools and ways to do that and to connect with your ancestors and to just do some self-inquiry and get some get a tarot reading and do all those things. I do all of that in the Wild Waters retreat. So if that's something that you're interested in, click the link below this video to schedule a free 30-minute chat with me. And that's it. Thank you so much for being here, and I will talk